In 1979, a frightening pattern of illness was discovered in the small town of Woburn, Massachusetts. Unusually high rates of birth defects and leukemia seemed to cluster around two town wells. It was the beginning of a long and frustrating search for answers by local residents. Statisticians played a key role in unraveling the Woburn mystery. Much of the evidence was in the form of percentages or proportions. For instance, was the proportion of birth defects for families drinking the suspect water significantly different from families not drinking the water, or was it just random variation at work? In the past several programs, we've been making inferences about population means. Now we'll learn the related techniques for population proportions to answer questions like those raised in Woburn. In this program, we'll learn to perform inference on proportions using a new kind of z-statistic. We'll see how to compute confidence intervals and do significance tests for proportions. And we'll move on to examine inference procedures for comparing proportions from two different populations. Inference for proportions, like inference for any population parameter, begins with a number derived from a sample. We use that statistic to estimate an unknown parameter. For instance, suppose we wanted to estimate the percentage of unemployed Americans. That's just one of the vital statistics issued each month by a powerful federal agency.
One of millions of Americans being dropped off at work? Yes, but as Commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Janet Norwood's job is to count those millions, and she can tell you what it takes to do that right.
The judicious investigation of fact and the fearless publication of the results thereof.
Today, she's at the Congress, announcing to the world the monthly U.S. unemployment percentages.
And unemployment in August was unchanged from July.
Every change in the proportion of Americans out of work looms quite large on the political scene, where the data are interpreted and used for public policy making.
In unemployment.
Frankly, I fully expected that unemployment would go down in August.
It's critical that this country get true, unvarnished, accurate reports of unemployment. Unemployment is our most significant statistic. It tells us whether we're moving into a recession. It gives us information on what the situation is in various places around the country.
To get a precise estimate of the proportion of unemployed workers, a large sample of the national population is taken by the Census Bureau.
We have a sample of approximately 50,000 households, 55,000 households across the entire country. It's approximately 120,000 people interviewed every month. We take counties as our basic building block within the country. We group those together into what we call primary sampling units. Those are in general large metropolitan areas, or in the rural parts of the country, they're a group of 2 or 3 counties.
Within each of the primary sampling units, groups of houses are randomly selected, and every person in a household is interviewed.
Good morning. My name is Terry Hansen. I'm from the United States Census Bureau.
A range of questions are posed, from type of work to hours worked, to wages earned, to reasons for lack of work.
Yes, I did.
To be counted as unemployed, a person must have worked less than an hour in the last week, must be available to work, and must be actively searching for work.
How many hours did you work last week at all jobs?
I worked 3 days, about 24.
24 hours?
Mm-hmm.
Do you usually work 35 hours or more a week at this job?
No.
The completed questionnaires are tabulated and processed, and the data is sent to the BLS for analysis. The staff then prepares the in-depth report Dr. Norwood will present to Congress, which covers every angle of the labor force picture.
The unemployment rate is up a tenth technically, but as we all know, that's not statistically significant.
Well, the situation with unemployment just hasn't changed very much over the last 6 months, and what's more important probably is that employment growth seems to be picking up a little.
Well, I think we might want to play that up in the release and give that a little feature, because we're not going to be able to talk about the extent of unemployment. It's about constant for the last 6 months. So let's play up the duration issue.
The central figure in the report is the national unemployment rate. With such a large sample, the confidence interval around this estimate is quite narrow.
That's right.
We have a band of certainty, which is within 0.19, within 0.2. So if the unemployment rate goes up 0.2, we know there's been a change.
But the same sample is tapped for unemployment data on individual states and for smaller segments of the population, such as Hispanics and blacks.
And the jobless rate for black men returned to 14.2%.
Changes in unemployment for these groups cannot be confirmed with the same precision as the national rate, and the figures become less dependable as the basis for policy decisions. As large as the national survey is, even larger samples are necessary to get more dependable estimates on small groups.
The data are never good enough for the uses that people want to make of them. Because we are not oversampling, we don't have a larger sample than is needed to get the national numbers, there is a wider band of uncertainty. In August, employment among black Americans was 825,000 higher than a year ago.
But unemployment is just one of the proportions the BLS tracks. The Consumer Price Index, Producer Price Index, inflation, productivity, the list is long. From Wall Street to Pennsylvania Avenue, from city planners to the International Monetary Fund, they rely on what the BLS produces, the most sensitive economic indicators the nation has.
We are moving fast in this country, really, to having an economy that is based on the numbers. So it is a very real responsibility for the entire statistical system in this country to try to produce the data that are required.
Let's compute our own unemployment confidence interval. For simplicity's sake, we'll suppose we had taken a simple random sample of 2,000 adults and found that 140 were unemployed. Our sample proportion is then 140 over 2,000, which is 0.07 or 7%. We call this sample proportion p hat, and that's the statistic we'll use to estimate the true proportion of unemployed workers in the country. To find our confidence interval, we first need to know the sampling distribution of our statistic. That's easy enough. A proportion is really just a count of something, like unemployed people, which is then considered as a fraction of the whole population. And when we're dealing with counts where the results are of the yes-no variety, we can use the binomial distribution, which is close to normal when n is large. So we can use normal calculations for proportions. The mean of the distribution of p hat is p, the true proportion in the population. The standard deviation is the square root of p times 1 minus p over n. That formula might look familiar because it's derived from the formula we've already learned for the standard deviation of a binomial distribution. Now, since we don't know p, we can use p hat instead because it's an excellent estimator of the true proportion when n is large. So we'll substitute p hat for the p's in the equation and come up with a perfectly serviceable estimate of the standard deviation of our p hat distribution. Now we can compute a confidence interval for an unknown proportion. Here's the formula. P hat plus or minus z star times the standard deviation. Now for the 95% confidence interval for our sample that found 140 unemployed people out of 2,000, p hat is 0.07. The z star value for 95% is 1.96 and n is 2,000. That gives us 0.07 plus or minus 0.011, 7% plus or minus 1.1%. That might seem like a fairly narrow interval, but it wouldn't be nearly narrow enough for the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The BLS demands confidence intervals which are measured in tenths of percentage points. You can see that figuring a confidence interval around a proportion is just a slight twist on what we already know. The same holds true for performing significance tests on proportions. We'll see how this works by using more pink slip data for a fictitious town. Let's say that the last census showed that 10% of the workforce was unemployed. Since this number came from a census, we can call it a population parameter. Now say it's 5 years later and we sample 500 town residents and find that 55 are out of work. So our sample proportion p hat is 11%. Is this evidence that the unemployment rate has gone up? Our null hypothesis, as usual, says that nothing but random variation is at work. P equals 0.1. The one-sided alternative hypothesis says that P is greater than 0.1. Now we can adapt our familiar z-statistic formula for standardizing. We take p hat, subtract the value of the mean specified by the null hypothesis, 0.1, then divide by the standard deviation. The square root of 0.1 times 1 minus 0.1 over the sample size, which is 500. That gives us a z-value of 0.75. The resulting p-value is fairly large, 0.23. In other words, there's a 23% chance of getting an unemployment rate as high as 11% in our sample just because of random variation. That's pretty high. We have no reason to reject the null hypothesis. The unemployment rate didn't change significantly. Inference procedures for single proportions are pretty straightforward, but quite often we want to compare two proportions in different populations. That was exactly the situation facing investigators in a small town in the late 1970s.
About a week before he died, I can remember him saying, "Why did those stupid people have to poison our water?" And that was, from the mouth of a 9-year-old.
Donna Robbins lives in Woburn, Massachusetts. She believes that the drinking water in her neighborhood caused the leukemia that killed her son Robbie. Bill Donovan believes the same contaminated water caused his daughter's crippling birth defect.
If you went down to the Abidjona River, right next to the wells, and seen what that looked like, you'd laugh. You'd say, I could not possibly be that crazy to drink that. Because something serious would happen to me. I'd either die or I'd poison myself or something else would happen.
In 1979, the city of Woburn was shaken by the simultaneous discoveries of toxic waste sites, contaminated well water, and extremely high rates of childhood leukemia, all on the east side of town. Until 1964, all the city's water was supplied by wells which drew from an aquifer on the west side of town. At that time, two new wells, G and H, were drilled in the Abidjona River aquifer to the east. Residents on the east side of Woburn began to receive some or all of their water from wells G and H, but none of the new water went to the west side of town. In 1979, a toxic waste site was discovered just upstream of G and H. EPA testing found the wells were contaminated with chemicals used by 3 companies, also located upstream of the wells: a machine and tooling division of W.R. Grace, a tannery owned by Beatrice Foods, and a large contract uniform supplier. Was there a link between the contaminated water and disease in East Woburn? The community turned to the Harvard School of Public Health and statistician Marvin Zellen for help.
What we agreed to do was to attempt to get new evidence. And we thought the most vulnerable group in the population were newborns and mothers who were pregnant. And if we were to focus on that and also find an association, then perhaps their concerns were real.
So in 1982, a group of 235 trained volunteers undertook a telephone sample survey of the city. They asked about adverse pregnancy outcomes and childhood disorders, as well as leukemia events occurring between 1960 and 1982. Since wells G and H closed in 1979, Zellen was able to use survey data to compare disease rates for the two sides of town when the suspect wells were not a factor. He found east-west incidence rates to be exactly the same when the well water was off. Zellen then compared disease rates for East Woburn people drinking the contaminated water with West Woburn people not drinking the water.
For the 76 to 79 period, when the wells were running in East Woburn, the East Woburn set of data had higher incidence rates than the West Woburn.
And so the Harvard study concluded that in East Woburn, indeed there were higher proportions of childhood leukemia, perinatal death, certain birth defects, and certain childhood disorders.
We showed very conclusively by many different analyses that there was a positive association with the amount of well water and adverse health events.
As the association between contaminated well water and children's health became public, families in the quiet East Woburn neighborhood organized and confronted the 3 businesses responsible for contaminating the water.
you have to be angry for anybody that's irresponsible. What you get to is that it's been done all over the country and the world, and you say, okay, you've done it for some crazy reason, it's been acceptable. But now it's been identified as a problem that's causing serious problems, even death. What are you going to do about it? And your real anger comes out when there's arrogance and defiance to you that they're not going to do anything about it.
In 1985, residents went to court to challenge the waste disposal practices of the three companies. Though the wells have closed and concerns about the drinking water have abated, the legal battles continue. For Donna Robbins, there are hard lessons to be learned from the Woburn experience.
It'll be worth it in the end if we win the suit to see that these chemical companies can't get away with what they've been doing and that they'll pay for it. It'll be worth it in that respect, but it's never going to bring back our children.
Because the Woburn investigators use sample surveys to gather their information, we can compute confidence intervals to estimate the true population proportions from the sample proportions. We'll use data collected from just the east side of town from 1960 to 1982, a period when the suspect wells were turned off and on for months or years at a time. Population 1 is children born to women who drank the water. They were pregnant when the wells were on. Population 2 is the children born to women who did not drink the water. They were pregnant when the wells were off. We'll compute a confidence interval for the difference between the proportion of birth defects in these two populations. During the time when the suspect water was being used, there were 16 birth defects in 414 births. When the suspect water was shut off, there were 3 defects in 228 births. The sample proportion of birth defects among the exposed children, p-hat1, is 0.039 or 3.9%. The proportion for the unexposed children, p-hat2, is 0.013 or 1.3%. So we can estimate the difference in the birth defect rates for the general populations of children born to exposed and unexposed mothers. It is 3.9% minus 1.3% or 2.6%. To compute a confidence interval, we first note that both sample proportions are nearly normally distributed. The distribution of the difference between two independent normal distributions is itself normal. Here's the normal distribution of the difference between two sample proportions, p-hat1 and p-hat2. It has a mean of p1 minus p2, the difference of the true proportions. The standard deviation equals this expression, which is basically a combination of the standard deviations of the two individual distributions. The d after sigma simply means difference. As before, we don't know p1 and p2, so we replace them with their sample estimates. This makes the expression equal to s of d rather than sigma d. So our confidence interval is p-hat1 minus p-hat2 plus or minus z star times the estimated standard deviation of the difference between the two proportions. Now let's calculate a 95% confidence interval for the size of the difference in proportions of birth defects. We know that z star for 95% is 1.96. Then we need to calculate s of d. First we substitute our values for p-hat1, then p-hat2, then both ends. Doing the arithmetic gives us 0.012. So the confidence interval of the difference in the birth defect rates for the two groups is 0.039 minus 0.013 plus or minus 1.96 times 0.012. That's 0.026 plus or minus 0.024, an interval from close to 0 to 5%. This result seems hard to interpret. The difference in the birth defect rates could be almost nothing, or it could be as high as 5%. But the interval lies entirely above 0, meaning it's unlikely that the well water has no effect on birth defects. There is a significant difference in birth defect rates between children born to women drinking the water and children born to women not drinking the water. Significance tests come into play quite often. For example, when historians and statisticians analyzed one of the most shocking episodes in American history.
On the top of Gallows Hill in Salem, Massachusetts, 19 people were hanged as witches in 1692. The landscape today is quiet, but during the notorious Salem witch trials, the hangman was busy here, executing innocent victims of what could only be understood until recently as a community gone mad with witch fever.
What happened in 1692 was not a hysterical, irrational outbreak in which an entire community rose up and began to charge its members randomly with the crime and sin of witchcraft.
What did happen in Salem, Nissenbaum found, was based on patterns of witch accusations that were more systematic than hysterical. Pre-1692 village records yielded interesting geographical associations.
We took a map of Salem Village, and on that map, we plotted the residences of every inhabitant of the community that we could locate. A great majority of those people who were accusing others of witchcraft, the accusers lived in one half of the village, on one side of this line, and that a great majority of those people who came to their defense, as well as the accused witches themselves, lived on the other side of that line. What we soon came to realize was that this geographic division corresponded to other kinds of political and economic and even religious divisions that had been brewing in Salem Village over the course of many years.
Those on the west side, the accusers, were traditional subsistence farmers fighting for political and religious independence from Salem. Those on the east side, the accused and the defenders, were economically oriented to the bustling commercial ocean port and opposed the Westerners' demands for an independent church or government. Tensions produced by this long and bitter division were laid bare during the witchcraft trials. The correlation between accusations and residents provided a context for understanding 1692. But could the differences just have been chance?
The statistician I.J. Good is supposed to have said that if you torture your data long enough, they'll confess.
Statistician George Cobb decided to find out.
The moral there is that with any data set, you can play around looking for patterns, and if you look long enough, you're certainly going to find patterns.
By analyzing the accusations historically and statistically, a more complete picture emerges. The geographical patterns of witch accusations were confirmed by Cobb through significance testing, lending credence to a discussion of the social and economic origins of the tragedy.
Historians can use significance testing to rule out chance as an explanation. Once they've done that, then they can consider other possibilities. There are going to be other instances where they can't rule out chance, and so along with whatever other explanations they consider, they always have to keep in mind that the pattern that they're working from may have been just coincidence.
Dr. Cobb tested other accusation proportions. Many involving the role of gender show that women were accused much more frequently than men during the Salem crisis. Patterns such as these conjure up new questions yet to be unraveled in this haunting historical mystery.
Salem is practically synonymous with witches, but it wasn't the only town that got caught in the grip of witch fever. We'll work through a significance test for the difference between two proportions using the conviction rates of men and women accused of witchcraft in the rest of New England. The available historical record shows that between 1630 and 1700, 20 men were accused of being witches. 2 were convicted, so P-hat 1 is 0.1 or 10%. 68 women were accused and 14 were convicted, so P-hat 2 is about 0.21 or 21%. 10% versus 21%. That seems like a significant difference, but is it? We'll use a significance test to see if a difference in conviction rates this large is likely to have occurred by chance alone. Our null hypothesis is that the conviction rates for men and women accused of witchcraft are the same, P1 equals P2. The alternative hypothesis is that the conviction rates are different, P1 doesn't equal P2. The hypothesis is two-sided because inequality in the rates could go either way. Because the null hypothesis assumes that P1 and P2 are equal, we can call this common value just P. That's the conviction rate for both men and women accused of witchcraft. We don't know this proportion, but we can estimate it by combining or pooling our sample proportions. Because 2 out of 20 men and 14 out of 68 women were convicted of being witches, that's 16 out of 88 for men and women combined, which is a pooled proportion of 18%. We'll call this estimate of the common proportion P-hat. The z-test statistic we'll use for the significance test is P-hat 1 minus P-hat 2 over a slightly different version of the standard deviation, which we label SPD. This term requires a little explanation. Here's the expression for the standard deviation we started with. We get the new expression for our standard deviation, SPD, by simply replacing p hat 1 and p hat 2 with the pooled proportion p hat. We can simplify our formula algebraically like this. And now we have our standard deviation, SPD, which stands for the pooled estimate of the standard deviation. To find SPD, we substitute the value we just found for p hat, 0.18, and the values of the two ends and crank out the answer, which is 0.098. Well, now we can get to work on our significance test. Here's our z statistic, 0.1 minus 0.21 over 0.098, which is negative 1.12. Remembering that our test is two-sided, we find a relatively large p-value of 0.26. How about that? Even though at first glance it would seem that women were getting the short end of the stick, there's really a 26% chance, or better than 1 in 4, of getting a difference this large by chance alone. In other words, we cannot reject the null hypothesis that the proportions of convictions for men and women are equal. In this program, we learned about inference for proportions. As before, these procedures are simply extensions of basic concepts we've already learned. In the next program, we'll continue this pattern by learning an important inference tool for looking at more than two variables at a time.